His wife still hides at night, knowing the terrible truth. In those woods, he tasted human flesh. But 35 years ago, David knew none of this. He only knew that the Great Smoky Mountains were vast, ancient, and indifferent to the ego of two young men in their 20s. David and his brother, Mark, had mapped the route with the precision of engineers but the arrogance of youth. They were looking for the Stone Hollow, a cluster of ruins left behind by settlers 2 centuries prior, a ghost town swallowed by the rhododendrons and mountain laurel. Before they ascended, they stopped at a rusted-out general store at the base of the trailhead to buy freeze-dried meals and fuel. The woman behind the counter, a local with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to look through them rather than at them, paused when Mark mentioned their destination. She did not offer a folksy anecdote. She simply gripped the counter and told them that the hollow was a place where the birds did not sing. She said a man had gone missing in that sector 2 months ago, and the search dogs had refused to track the scent past the ridge. David laughed it off as local color, a ghost story to scare tourists, but Mark went quiet. They bought their supplies and left, leaving the old woman's heavy gaze fixed on their backs. For the first 2 days, the hike was brutal but beautiful. The forest was dense, a wall of green and brown, but by the 3rd afternoon, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew still, heavy with a humidity that felt unnatural for the altitude. As they neared the coordinates of the ruins, the silence the old woman predicted became a physical weight. There were no crickets, no wind in the canopy, no rustling of small mammals. It was a vacuum of sound. They set up camp a half-mile from the stone foundations they had spotted through the trees, planning to explore them at first light. But sleep was impossible. Around 2:00 a.m., a sound drifted from the direction of the ruins. It was not the wind. It was a low, rhythmic weeping that occasionally broke into a sharp, jagged whimper. It sounded unmistakably human, yet stripped of all language. Raw distress broadcast into the dark. David sat up, his sleeping bag rustling loudly in the quiet. Mark was already awake, clutching his flashlight, his knuckles white. They debated in hushed, frantic whispers. Logic dictated they wait for dawn. Instinct screamed at them to pack up and run the other way. But the moral imperative of the Good Samaritan won out. Someone was hurt. Perhaps it was the missing hiker the woman had mentioned, lying there with a broken leg for weeks, miraculously alive. David grabbed the first aid kit, and Mark took the heavy flashlight. They moved through the undergrowth, the beam cutting a cone through the suffocating blackness. The weeping grew louder, wet and guttural. It was coming from the largest structure, a roofless stone shell that had once been a home. They reached the doorway, a gaping mouth in the stone. The smell hit them before they saw anything. A coppery, rancid stench of old iron and something sweet, like rotting fruit. David felt his stomach turn, but he pushed Mark forward. They stepped over the threshold, the flashlight sweeping across the dirt floor until it landed on a figure huddled in the far corner. The choice had been made. They were inside. The beam of light trembled as Marcus' hand shook, illuminating a man who looked less like a human and more like a discarded husk. He was shirtless, his skin gray and pulled tight over his ribs, covered in layers of filth and dried black streaks. He sat cross-legged, facing the wall, his back to them. The weeping had stopped the moment the light touched him, replaced by a wet, rhythmic smacking sound. It was the sound of mastication, heavy, labored chewing. "Hey!" David's voice cracked, sounding small in the stone room. "We're here to help. Are you okay?" The figure did not flinch. He did not turn around. He just kept chewing, his head bobbing slightly with the effort. The smell was overpowering now, thick enough to taste. David took a step forward, his boots crunching on debris. He needed to assess the injury. He needed to be the hero. He reached out, intending to touch the man's shoulder, to snap him out of his trance. "Sir, we have a radio. We can get a chopper," David said, moving to the side to see the man's face. Then the man turned. David froze, his breath hitching in a strangled gasp. The man's eyes were wide, blown pupils surrounded by whites that were yellowed and bloodshot. But it was his mouth that shattered David's reality. The man's lips were stained crimson, his chin dripping with fresh, bright blood. In his hands he held his own left forearm. The flesh had been stripped away in jagged, uneven tears, exposing the white of the radius bone and the twitching red musculature beneath. The man was not injured by a bear. He was not starving in the traditional sense. He was eating himself. Time seemed to warp. David watched in paralyzed horror as the man looked directly at him, then deliberately lowered his mouth back to his own ravaged arm and tore off another strip of flesh with a sickening, wet snap. He swallowed it whole, his throat convulsing. There was no pain in his eyes, only a hollow, bottomless hunger. Mark screamed. It was a primal sound that broke the trance. The man hissed, a sound like a leaking steam pipe, and shifted his weight, tensing his legs as if to spring. The realization hit David like a physical blow. This was not a rescue mission. They were intruders in a predator's den. The sheer wrongness of the act, the violation of the most basic biological imperative to survive, triggered a wave of nausea and terror so profound that David nearly vomited. "Run!" Mark choked out. They did not wait to see if the man would chase them. They scrambled backward, tripping over loose stones, scrambling out of the ruins and into the dark forest. They ran blindly, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the trees, creating strobe light monsters in the periphery. They did not stop at the campsite. They grabbed their packs and kept running, risking broken ankles on the uneven terrain, fueled by an adrenaline that tasted like copper. Behind them, the silence of the woods had returned, heavy and judging, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if they would escape the gravity of what they had seen. The descent that should have taken 6 hours took them 3. They arrived at the ranger station at dawn, battered, scratched, and bordering on hysterical. The search and rescue team was deployed within the hour, a helicopter chopping through the morning mist toward the coordinates David had shakily circled on a map. David and Mark sat in the station's break room, wrapped in shock blankets, staring into styrofoam cups of lukewarm coffee. They did not speak. They could not find the words to articulate the image of the man's teeth sinking into his own radius. By late afternoon, the sheriff walked in. He was a heavy-set man who had seen hiking accidents, bear attacks, and exposure deaths, but he looked pale. He sat across from them and placed a tape recorder on the table. "We found him," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "Yes, alive. Barely. He's in critical condition at the trauma center in Knoxville. Severe dehydration, sepsis, and, obviously, the self-inflicted wounds." David nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering horror. "He was crazy," David whispered. "Starvation made him go crazy. He was eating himself." The sheriff looked at David, and for a moment, there was a flash of pity in his eyes. Then he leaned forward. "That's what we thought at first, son. The boys at the scene, they found the remains of his arm. But they found something else, too." The room went cold. Mark looked up. "What else?" "There was a lot of blood in that ruin," the sheriff said, choosing his words with agonizing care. "More than one man could lose and still be sitting up. And they found bone fragments in the corner. Rib bones." David felt the blood drain from his face. Ribs? He was eating his arm. The lab ran a quick type match on the dried blood on the floor versus the fresh blood on the suspect. The sheriff interrupted. "The man you saw, his name is Elias Thorne. He went missing 2 months ago. But the dried blood on the floor? S type O negative. Thorne is type A." David's mind reeled, trying to process the implication. There was another hiker reported missing 3 weeks before Thorne. The sheriff continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "A guy named Paul Miller. We never found him. Until today." The sheriff paused, letting the silence expand. "Thorne did not start eating himself because he ran out of food, boys. He started eating himself because he ran out of Paul." The revelation hit David with the force of a collision. The man in the ruins had not just succumbed to madness and autophagia. He was a murderer, a cannibal. He had hunted, killed, and consumed another human being, and only when that meat was gone did he turn his hunger inward. The monster they had pitted, the man they had tried to save, had been sitting in a slaughterhouse of his own making, filled with the energy of a consumed soul. If they had stayed 1 minute longer, if they had been slower, they would not have been rescuers. They would have been the next meal. 35 years passed. David grew old, raised a family, and buried his brother Mark, who died of a heart attack in his late 40s, never having stepped foot in a forest again after that trip. David rarely spoke of the Smokies. The story became a dark knot in his memory, a cautionary tale he told his own children only in vague terms about respecting nature. But the closure he thought he had was a lie. On the anniversary of the event, David received a phone call from a journalist writing a book about Appalachian cold cases. She wanted a quote about the Stone Hollow incident. David refused, intending to hang up, but the journalist pushed. She had interviewed Elias Thorne's wife. Thorne had survived miraculously. He had been institutionalized for a decade, deemed criminally insane, and eventually released into the care of his devoted, perhaps delusional, wife under a new name in a different state. She told me something strange, the journalist said, unaware that she was picking at a scab on David's soul. She said they have a good life, mostly, but she has insomnia. She said she spends a lot of nights in the guest bedroom closet. David gripped the phone. Why? She said Elias wakes up in the middle of the night. He shakes her awake, terrified. He tells her to hide. He tells her, "The man is coming. The man who eats is coming." He cries and begs her to lock herself away until morning. David closed his eyes. The image of the ruins flooded back. The gray skin, the bloodshot eyes, the rhythmic chewing. She thinks he's having flashbacks. The journalist continued, that he's trying to protect her from the memory of the thing that hunted him in the woods. She thinks he created a boogeyman in his mind to cope with what he did. No, David said, his voice trembling. The insight washed over him, cold and absolute. Elias Thorne had not created a boogeyman. There was no monster in the woods that had forced him to eat Paul Miller. The hunger had come from within Elias. It was a dormant seed that germinated in the isolation of the Stone Hollow. She does not understand, David whispered into the receiver. He is not warning her about a stranger. David hung up the phone. He sat in his comfortable armchair, staring into the dark of his living room. He pictured Elias Thorne, now an old man, waking up in a sweat, the taste of copper flooding his mouth, his stomach cramping with a forbidden, ancient craving. Elias was not hallucinating an intruder. He was feeling the monster rising inside his own skin. He was waking his wife to save her from himself. Somewhere, in a quiet suburban house, a woman was locking herself in a closet, waiting for the sun to rise, while on the other side of the door, her husband sat on the edge of the bed, weeping and salivating, staring at his own hands, wondering if tonight was the night he would finally finish the meal he started 35 years ago.